You're all very, very welcome. Tickets for this event are selling on the black market at very inflated prices. It's been sold out for some time. So, in March of this year, Pankaj Mishra published an essay in the London Review of Books and released a film in which he reads the essay titled The Shoah After Gaza. It was a profoundly serious deep dive into the history of Zionism, the seismic impact of the Holocaust, and the consequences of the foundation of the State of Israel. It caused considerable and heated debate, and the film has been viewed probably hundreds of thousands of times now, I imagine, Pankaj. It certainly had a lot of views the last time I looked. In the essay, Pankaj seeks to answer the questions, quote, how did Israel come to exercise such a terrible power of life and death over a population of refugees? And, quote, how can the Western political and journalistic mainstream ignore, even justify, its clearly systematic cruelties and injustices, end quote. He explores the overarching role the Shoah, the Holocaust, has achieved in modern Jewish identity, Zionism, Israeli national ideology, and Western responses to the State of Israel. He's the author of 7 non-fiction books, including From the Ruins of Empire and Age of Anger, both hugely influential in considerations of colonialism, post-colonialism, imperialism and its consequences, the rise of the right and the many complications of the post-war era in India, the Middle East and the West. He's also written 2 novels, The Romantics and Run and Hide. He regularly contributes to the London Review of Books, The Guardian, The New York Times, and The New Yorker, and we are delighted to welcome him to First Thought Talks, especially in the week when Benjamin Netanyahu wickedly addressed a partisan section of the US Houses of Congress without ever mentioning the appalling toll of civilian life his forces are taking in Gaza, now at almost 40,000 people. As you will know, Pankaj was to be interviewed by his friend and fellow author Andrew O'Hagan. Alas, Andrew succumbed to the ubiquitous COVID-19 on Wednesday, and he's currently isolating and hopefully recovering. It hasn't gone away, you know. It's everywhere here too now. Somebody in this room probably has it, but we can't think about that. I'm more grateful than I can say to Fintan O'Toole for stepping in immediately to take his place. My heart was in my mouth when I rang him. It shouldn't have been. He's the most obliging of people, and he immediately said that he would. He is a great favourite at First Thought Talks, and you all know what a towering force he is in Irish and international journalism, history and commentary. I couldn't have hoped for a better replacement for Andrew. Please welcome Pankaj Mishra and Fintan O'Toole.
Good evening, everybody. It's as my wife always tells me, it's a terrible disappointment that I'm not Andrew O'Hagan, the brilliant and beautiful Andrew. But nonetheless, in spite of the humiliation, I was very, very happy indeed to have the opportunity to meet and converse with someone I've admired hugely for a very long time. Some of you, I'm sure, might have been here last weekend in this room when we were talking with Susan Neiman. And for those of you who weren't here, it was kind of a poignant event in a way, because Susan is one of the great promoters of the Enlightenment, director of the Einstein Forum in Berlin. Susan is Jewish, is a great champion of the Jewish Universalist tradition, but also someone who has come under enormous pressure and huge criticism, and indeed threats in Germany for criticizing Israel. And this kind of grotesque situation where someone like that is virtually accused of anti-Semitism, for upholding the great Jewish Universalist traditions of human rights and ethical rationality. And I suppose in a way that's somewhat of the context in which we're speaking today. I suppose it might be worth starting by saying why this is a difficult subject to address and why your own essay is so important. It's difficult because there are 2 realities we have to keep in mind. Well, one is that the Holocaust happened. It's appalling we have to say this, but there's still a kind of toxic culture of denial and minimization. And equally, anti-Semitism is a profound reality in Europe and in the West. It's a constitutive part of our culture, which has not gone away, and which retains the ability to do enormous harm. And so there's that reality which we have to bear in mind. And the other reality is that both of these things, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, are kind of relentlessly exploited, misused, and in terrible ways actually trivialized by being used for political purposes to say, first of all, that Israel is allowed to do whatever it wishes because of the Holocaust. And it sort of seems to license a certain kind of exceptionalism. And secondly, that anybody who even points this out or who is critical of what Israeli governments do is being an anti-Semite. So given that sort of context, could you just tell us what was your own thought process in terms of approaching, at this terrible moment in history, writing an essay like that?
Thank you, Fintan. I think, I started thinking about this subject a long time ago, but certainly the motivation to write this particular piece emerged out of the outrage, I think is the best way to define it, that many of us felt days after Hamas's attack on October 7th, when it was very clear that this very extremist government, the most extremist government in the history of Israel, was going to use the opportunity to accomplish many of its openly stated aims. And then weeks passed, thousands of civilians slaughtered, including unconscionable number of children. And as Katrina mentioned, just in the last 3 days, for instance, here is a man who's probably going to be wanted very soon in more than 100 countries for war crimes, who goes to Washington, is given a standing ovation, meets various politicians, dignitaries, including the Christian evangelist who believes, John Hagee, who believes that the Führer was instructed by God to take Jews to the Promised Land. He receives this fellow, goes to the White House. Biden says, "Welcome back, Mr. Prime Minister." So anybody who observes this spectacle outside of those very small circles, and I would insist that these are very small circles, is simply outraged by this kind of behavior, both at the sort of political level and at the moral level. And I think I really wrote this because I felt I can't live with this feeling of impotence and outrage. And I should also say that this particular moral atmosphere you just described, in which criticism of Israel is immediately termed anti-Semitic, and the person expressing that criticism is at risk of in destroying the career, basically. That is something that I came to much later in my life. I mean, I grew up in India in a very different climate altogether, in that there were Jews in India, that there was an ancient community of Jews, and also Jews of European ancestry, but there was no tradition of anti-Semitism. And there was very little knowledge of the Holocaust, very little knowledge of the Shoah. Jews were very prominent in public life in the 19th century. The poet Secret Sassoon, his family, many of you would know, came originally from Baghdad, went to India, then to China, became very crucial in the sort of 19th century globalizing Asia. Of course, ended up in London. Also the Kaduris. And they were also very pro-British, but all the resentment against the Jewish business families was not anti-Semitic. In fact, the anti-Semitism that they suffered came from other British businessmen in Asia. They were really seen by Chinese or Indians as essentially compradors or working with British imperialists. For instance, the Sassoons were very prominent in the opium trade. So I was really, I think growing up in India, going to Bombay, where so many sort of public spaces, libraries, statues built by the Sassoons or dedicated Sassoons, there was never really any awareness of this particular European tradition. So my own bafflement at this has been greater as a result, is that what is this peculiar relationship between the state of Israel and Western powers? which allows Israel to get away with morally the most obscene and outrageous behavior. And that's a sort of puzzle that I've been kind of trying to, in a way, in my own way, trying to understand. And there were, there have been obstacles, whereas I remember the moments in the past where I asked the magazines that I used to write for in the United States whether I could write on this subject. And the answer was, a very blunt no, because I didn't really have the proper credentials for it. And they had their own people writing on that particular subject, people that they trusted, and people they trusted to stick to a agreed upon consensus on that issue. So I think to answer your question in this very long-winded way, it's only sort of a few months ago that I put together many of these thoughts, and I had written about it, but it was in a Abu Dhabi newspaper nobody read, The National, which had a very nice weekend review briefly for a couple of years, edited by a friend of mine, and then occasionally in The Guardian. But it was really impossible for me to write about it for the American press. So it came out of, that piece came out of sort of years of puzzling over this and sort of feeling that there was certainly an atmosphere in which Israel was considered uncriticizable. And that had really created, in a way, a political situation that was highly damaging, not just to the Palestinians, but also to Israel itself.
Yes. I mean, I'm unfortunately old enough to remember when I would say the consensus in Ireland, broadly speaking, was very pro-Israeli. In 1967, for example, I remember I grew up in working class Dublin, and this wasn't intellectual circles, but there was a real sense that people, because of the Holocaust, did understand what the underlying trauma of the Jewish people was, and had a real sense of the Jewish people were the underdogs, and a kind of a natural alignments, with the underdog, particularly when the conflict was understood as an international conflict. So it was seen as Israel against Jordan, Egypt, Syria, there's the whole range of international players. Was that similar still in your use in India? Was there still a kind of, you explained how there wasn't obviously the same kind of historical awareness necessarily, but was there the same kind of instinctive sympathy with Israel?
Well, I think in the particular culture or intellectual culture, political culture that I belong to, or my family belonged to, that was very peculiar. Now it's a mainstream culture in India. So it doesn't feel so weird anymore. But back then in the 1970s and 80s, my family of upper caste in Hindus were very sympathetic to Israel. And they had precisely that vision of Israel as surrounded by incredibly aggressive, if not genocidal, Arab and Muslim enemies. And they had this vision because they believed, those very same Muslims were also suffocating India very slowly. There were Pakistanis and, of course, Indian Muslims constituting the internal enemy, as it were. So we sort of, I grew up with that particular vision of Israel as a beleaguered, besieged state that really needed to do all kinds of extraordinary things in order to protect itself. But that obviously, began to change once I went to university, came into contact with Palestinian students. There were a lot of Palestinian students because the Indian government diplomatically, politically, was very sympathetic to the Palestinians. So they were one of the first countries to recognize the PLO. They were the first countries to also kind of, open up representation, to invite them to various international conferences. And they refused to recognize Israel for a long time, refused to establish diplomatic relations until the early 90s, I think. But my family and I, we were in this particular group of people who always thought that the Indian government was wrong in not establishing relations with Israel, and that the Israelis, or Zionists at least, were our compatriots in many ways, because they had also fought this, incredibly difficult battle for national sovereignty. And they were also people, most importantly, people who knew how perfidious and dangerous Muslims were, generally. Right. So that there was that particular kind of ideological alliance. But what I'm also remembering is that there was sort of deeper connection where the sort of early Hindu nationalists were very sympathetic to both Zionism and also Nazism, because in both they saw a kind of nation-building ideology. And I think these overlaps are really fascinating. They are much more revealing than these particular national histories of Zionism or India, or for that matter, of the European Enlightenment.
Yes, yes. One of the threads that you follow in the essay is looking at a small number of really important Holocaust survivors who were immense moral figures in the aftermath of the Shoah, who wrote about it, who wrote about their own experience, but also tried to understand what this meant for humanity, and some of their attitudes to Israel and how those attitudes change. Would you maybe just give us some sense of who those figures for you are that are most important, and what it is they ended up having to say about Israel?
Well, I think, someone like Primo Levi, who I quote a lot in that piece, I started reading him, I think, early 90s onwards, without really having a broad, very clear sense of just what he represented. I mean, I read those books as, in the way they were presented, really, to us, which were memoirs by Holocaust survivors. And that itself seemed so compelling. Here is someone who's actually survived a monstrous crime and reflected intelligently and sensitively on this subject. I really knew very little about what he had said about Israel. That was certainly not in any of the books that I read at the time. I went back to Primo Levi after visiting Israel and the occupied territories. And that was really a traumatic experience, because by the time I visited Israel, 2008, a lot of my childish Zionism had been dispelled. Obviously, there were just too many, there had been too many disasters and sort of instances of uncontrolled violence by the Israelis for me to examine that early Zionism. But there was a kind of residual Zionism still there. And so I was really shocked. To see the way in which Israel enforced its occupation and the way essentially apartheid existed in the occupied territories, and the way it was brutally enforced. It was a really traumatizing experience. I remember feeling very disturbed by that visit for months afterwards. And it was during that period that I started to go back to Primo Levi and also started to read more widely in this literature. I was sort of seeking some answers to that. And that's when I discovered that Primo Levi had engaged with the state of Zionism after the formation of Israel, and that he had incredibly negative things to say about the way Israel had conducted itself, not just in 1982 when it invaded Lebanon and killed thousands of people, and indeed presided over a massacre in the refugee camps near Beirut, but also previously the arrival of someone who was clearly, inspired by European fascism. I'm speaking of Menachem Begin, who could trace very clearly his own sort of, genealogy in European fascism. He had become the prime minister. Revisionist Zionists were setting the political agenda in Israel, and Primo Levi, also Jean Emery, who I really only discovered later, was also one of those Holocaust survivors who felt an emotional connection with Israel, and then were deeply appalled by the way Israel had betrayed, or at least seemed to have betrayed, its original promise. And that was a kind of revelation to me, because again, by that time, with all these efforts to write about the subject for American papers, I realized there's actually this incredibly alive, dynamic tradition of Jewish anti-Zionists, of people who had suffered in their own bodies, all the torments that had been inflicted on a despised minority in Europe, and who had really come away with a very different set of lessons. These were not lessons that any nationalist project could easily incorporate. In fact, they were in many ways, completely contrary to the Zionist project. So I started to, reread the sort of critiques of these survivors. And again, thinking about this piece, I thought, how does one talk about things or talk in a way that doesn't get you immediately denounced as an anti-Semite and, really kind of banished from the mainstream press? I think the one way to do it is to quote at great length the people who had suffered the worst atrocities, and yet spoken about Israel with a kind of, completely irreproachable moral authority. And I think, so much of the piece is really consisting of quotations and sort of taking the reader through their particular intellectual and moral journeys.
One of the things you do very powerfully as well in the essay is to remind us of this actually very complicated history of the relationship between Israel and Holocaust survivors. It's sort of taken for granted now that, Israel founded its identity on the escape from Europe after the Holocaust. But of course, most of the founders of Israel were already in Palestine. There is this terrible irony, it's a profound tragedy in a way that Israel was too late. The idea, it's impossible for anybody to argue. You can argue about Zionism, you can argue about it, but it's impossible to argue that Jews who said that Europe was not safe for them were wrong, And so there was this idea of the foundation of a Jewish state as a refuge, but of course the refuge comes too late. It's the people for whom it is primarily constructed are exterminated, And in the early years of Israel, as you point out, certainly up to the Eichmann trial, all the evidence from Holocaust survivors who moved to Israel is they're treated almost as pariahs. People don't want to know. They're seen as shameful. Yeah. They're associated, and of course this is trauma. It's not. There's no great mystery about this. It's appalling to have to try to deal with these things, but they're seen as the reminders of this terrible shame. They're suspected. How did you survive when other people didn't survive? And people don't want to hear their stories at all, and so many of them have now subsequently spoken about this. So how do you think that plays into this sort of strange relationship between Israel and the Holocaust? Because it's not at all straightforward.
It's not at all straightforward, and that was, it's another kind of revelation for me, because I'd assumed, like most people, that Israel springs more or less organically from the experience of the Holocaust, and that the memory of the Holocaust is automatically, instinctively enshrined at the center of Israeli nationalism. And this is something, that must have happened right away. But then, you look a little bit closer into the history of Zionism and you realize that actually, like most of the nationalisms, in fact, I would venture to say all nationalisms, Zionism is also full of myths, full of self-serving, self-perpetuating ideas about its history, about its origins, and that actually the biggest myth is that the state of Israel is something that is really essentially created by Zionism. The fact that most Jewish people across Europe had no interest in Zionism, had no interest in going to Palestine, and Israel is very much a creation of historical contingency, as you described. It's really not until the end of the war, the Second World War, that Israel starts to look like a possibility. And then even then, so many hurdles have to be overcome, so many things have to happen. The British have to get exhausted and decide they want to leave it to the United Nations. So many things could have gone wrong back in the mid-1940s. And then during all this time, the very small number of Zionists who are already in Palestine, including David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, and other Zionists, are looking at diaspora Jews with a lot of contempt, because these people have failed to join them in Palestine. And they are seen essentially as lambs going passively to the slaughter. And when the Nazi crimes are revealed, that's their attitude, essentially. That these are people who are, such losers, basically. They did not join us in Israel. And look at what happened to them. And of course, now we will, welcome them, because we want a Jewish majority in Palestine. We constitute a minority. So in order to have a Jewish majority, we need as many people as possible. So they go out and do propaganda in the Jewish refugee camps in Europe. A lot of Jews in the refugee camps actually want to go to the United States. They want to go to other European countries. But the Zionists, managed to persuade quite a lot of them. They go to Iraq. I mean, it's an extraordinary story. They go to Iraq. Avi Shalem talks about it in his new memo. And they organize attacks on synagogue in Baghdad, so as to make it seem that Jewish life in Iraq is freshly endangered, and to allow sort of enable and basically force, not enable, but force Jews living in Iraq, and they'd been living there for centuries and centuries, to move to Israel. So all kinds of incredibly unscrupulous deeds and actions that the Zionist mainstream engages in at that time. And then, of course, the people from the Middle East, from the Middle Eastern countries arrive. They, by the way, are also treated with great contempt, because they are the dark-skinned Jews.
Yeah.
In fact, some of them are treated, they're sprayed with insecticide when they arrive in Israel. And there are various other versions of the racism, really naked racism that they encounter there. And then the survivors arrive, and again, they're seen as shamefully weak for the reasons you mentioned. There must be something wrong if they managed to survive, and so many good people died. And also, they are reminders of weakness. And Zionism, like nationalism, most nationalisms, including Hindu nationalism, is built on the fantasy of strength. Is built on a sort of vision of hypermasculinity. And weakness doesn't really form part of their particular narrative. It's something to be excluded, something to be banished to the margins, explained away. So they try they try very hard to even sort of reinterpret certain episodes during the Holocaust, like the Warsaw Uprising, like this is something led by Zionists. A complete falsehood. Zionists were hardly in the picture there. They were mostly socialists, they were communists, there were various other Jewish groups, but they try and appropriate that, try to present that there was resistance during the Holocaust, and we know that there was actually very little meaningful resistance, and not because not for want of trying. It's just that it was impossible. There were more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war in the Nazi camps, and there was hardly any resistance from them either. But
very hard if you're being starved to death, too.
Exactly. They were. I think 3.2 million Soviet prisoners were starved to death. Yeah. But anyway, they are so invested in this idea that of strength, of national strength, national vigor, nation building, that they ignore, pour contempt upon the survivors of the Holocaust. And then it's only really later, in the 1960s onwards, that this sort of particular narrative of Israel as essentially redemption for the survivors, a refuge for the survivors of the Shoah, an atonement for the powerlessness of the Jews worldwide, and a guarantee that this will never happen again. This particular narrative. And also, very important part of that narrative, it's about to happen, but it won't happen again. It's about to happen because the Nazis are now Arabs. The Nazis are now the people surrounding us. So this particular narrative, which I'm sure we encountered a lot in the last few months, that they are hell-bent upon perpetrating another Holocaust. The kind of this particular memory of the Holocaust was invoked again and again. But I think this particular narrative of the Holocaust, and it's been well documented by so many different scholars, was a particular political narrative created in the 1960s largely, and then institutionalized in all kinds of ways through museums, through school textbooks, through various systems of indoctrination, and basically made central to the narrative of Israeli nationalism, and I think to the core sort of, the core self-perception of the average Israeli. And it's probably the most powerful, the most potent national narrative I can think of.
Yeah. One of the key things, as well as what's happening inside Israel, is also what happens in the West. So the West, to use that sort of portmanteau term, but in general accurate. The Cold War, of course, is a huge factor in this, so there's very broad support for Israel in general, in Europe and in the United States, of course. But it's a not uncritical support for a very long time. I mean, there is at least a sense that America in particular is imposing some limits. It's kind of saying, well, yeah, we support you, we support you financially, we support you militarily, we support you politically, we support you diplomatically, we will block criticism in the United Nations, but you have to uphold your ends of it by behaving in a civilized manner, and that's a term we might come back to because it's very freighted. One of the things that I'd forgotten, and you reminded me in the essay of this, is that Ronald Reagan uses the word Holocaust about what Israel is doing in Lebanon in the early 1980s. And we were just talking about this and saying, if you used the word Holocaust in America about what Israel's doing in Gaza, you're gone. You're persona non grata for maybe quite good reasons. Actually, maybe it's not a word you should use. But the fact that Reagan can use it, the fact that George Bush, can pretty clear in terms of saying to Israel, if you don't stop doing this stuff, there will be consequences. Why does that cease to be the case?
It's an extraordinary story. I mean, it's ironically, given that the Republican Party has now emerged as the most sort of stalwart supporters of Israel, of any political formation anywhere in the modern West today, it's really worth remembering that Reagan said that, and also he wrote this in his diary, in his personal diary. And it's in response to images of children being killed in Lebanon. And he writes it down very proudly in the diary that I told him, to stop it. This is the Holocaust, and he objected, and I told him. There are other instances too of George Bush Sr. being very tough with the Israelis over settlement building, and also being tough with them over various acts of violence they engaged in the occupied territories. I think there are various ways to answer that question. One is definitely the increasing attraction of a generation, a very powerful and influential generation of Jewish Americans who are now in their 50s, almost all above the age of 50, 60, I think, who developed a very strong emotional attachment to Israel. Like many immigrant communities in the United States, including most famously the Irish Americans, now increasingly, visibly, the Indian Americans, who are great supporters of Narendra Modi in India. It's a particular psychological tendency among immigrant communities, particularly in a kind of multicultural society, to find ways of anchoring themselves, anchoring their identity, of defining themselves, and often in a society that it's really purely materialistic, organized around the pursuit of money and success, to attach yourself to the homeland in some form or other. And that engagement has ramified, starting off as an emotional attachment after the '67 war. It now has, extends into all kinds of directions, including the political realm, where you see very, very important alliances between the lobby groups that lobby for Israel, and also corporate groups that essentially want to preserve a plutocracy. So for what is often referred to as the Israel lobby is actually more than an Israel lobby. It's not just lobbying for Israel. It's lobbying for some of the most important corporate groups in the country who are not many of them are not Jewish, they're not even Zionists. But these alliances have developed over time, and they've become hugely influential in shaping American policy. And also, I think what is also happening, that there is definitely a feeling of retrenchment, because a lot of younger Jewish Americans are quite rightly repulsed by the behavior of Israel. And so they constitute really a very dangerous element for, I think, the status quo at present. So as a response to this particular danger, I think these people, the sort of Israel lobby groups, have doubled down and made it almost impossible for criticism of Israel, which used to be, widely heard, widely sort of expressed. They managed to delegitimate it quite effectively, and it's an extraordinary instance of many different kinds of sources of power coming together to enforce this particular climate.
And of course, one of the most bizarre aspects of this as well is this alliance between right-wing Israel and fundamentalist Christianity in America, whose roots are profoundly anti-Semitic, and whose millenarian vision is that when the Jews take over the Middle East, the end days will come and they will all convert to Christianity. So it's actually another version of saying the Jews will disappear and Christianity will win. And it's one of those things that sounds so outrageous, you think it can't really be effective, but it's at the root of a great deal of what's happening in Trump's Republican Party, for example. I mean, if you look at the Republican convention, perhaps this is one of the great crises of Jewish identity in America, which is that actually many of the most profoundly pro-Israel and most vocal in delegitimizing any criticism of Israel are right-wing fundamentalist Christians. And that must pose a huge challenge, I think, for young Jewish people in America.
Very much so. I mean, this is another dimension that, you have these crazy, fanatical fundamentalists who are basically interested in Israel because it's a precondition for Armageddon.
Yeah.
The fact that this alliance consists of, the fundamentalist Christians on one hand, the sort of corporate lobby groups, but together they constitute this really formidable power. And I think they are really in a kind of desperate phase right now. This is what I sense, which explains the sort of really the recourse to the most vulgar, most violent forms of censorship. I mean, the assault on the students in particular, on university campuses, and the sort of the standing ovation to Netanyahu when he mentioned the student protests. Yeah. I think there's a kind of real investment in suppressing violently, if necessary, any kind of protest or dissent coming, especially from the younger Jewish Americans, because it's now really an existential issue. And I feel that is also probably that insight is probably also relevant for white nationalists elsewhere. Yeah. That they have always identified with Israel. Israel can do a lot of things that they would like to do, but can't do. I mean, I think if you say, Germany for the Germans or Serbia for the Serbians, you can't really get away with it anymore. But Israelis can say that. They can make that actually part of their constitution. And this is something the white nationalists really love. Yeah. They would like to say that in their own respective countries. And so there's always been this vicarious identification with Israel, which now that the white nationalists are surging across Europe is now becoming a deeper investment in the future of revisionist Zionism, in the future of people like Netanyahu.
Yes. And you end up with the ultimate in the grotesque, I suppose, which is that, after the Holocaust, if you look at the general discourse around it, it's the never again discourse, but it's not never again for Jews. I mean, it's humanity. Humanity has been in this abyss, and it must build international institutions. It must regain ideas of universal rights, universal law. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights really is a response to the Holocaust. And it's also, in some ways, a culmination of the great Jewish universalist tradition, as well as other traditions. I'm not suggesting it's the only one, but it's a critical component of the intellectual genealogy of that. And the implications of that are profoundly anti-racist. You know, they start with the idea that you cannot do these things to human beings. Doesn't matter why, it doesn't matter how, it doesn't matter, you know, you can't do the what about that stuff, what about they did to us. You know, you just can't do them. There are laws. And the undermining of that order is not just Israel's fault, right? But the distortion of the Holocaust plays into this, doesn't it? Because instead of saying that this is telling us that this is a universal moral command, it becomes the opposite in a way, which is, well, we can do that to them because we have suffered more than anybody else. And you've written elsewhere so brilliantly about, you know, this rise of right-wing nationalism and all that, and which at the center of which is a kind of competitive victimhood. And so you get this betrayal of the Holocaust really in this idea of you can use it to prove that you've suffered more than anybody else, and therefore your infliction of suffering is not the same as anybody else's infliction of suffering. It is exceptional. And it's striking that Netanyahu, in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas atrocities of October 7th, very, very quickly started talking about barbarism and civilization, you know, which is, of course, this polarization of humanity. There's the civilized people who are us, and the barbarians. Animals was used again in a lot of Israeli rhetoric. The dehumanization of Palestinians. And of course, in the end, this, and I think you write very powerfully about this in the essay, I mean, it reconstructs racism. I mean, it's fundamentally based on the fact that those people's lives do not matter as much as our lives do because they're not like us.
Exactly. No, it's. I mean, I think one of the people I quote in the piece, Zygmunt Bauman, who says very clearly that you know, the Israelis have seen the Holocaust as a private matter between them and anti-Semites. There's a lot more to be said about the Holocaust. And actually, the person who reflected on this and reflected on the various dimensions of the Holocaust was Hannah Arendt,
yes.
Who kind of, you know, traced in the origins of totalitarianism, traced it back to the racist rhetoric of the 19th century, the beginning of that kind of rhetoric, the beginning of dehumanization, essentially, and you know, I mean, and actually she says at one point, I can't remember if it's the origins or elsewhere, that the Holocaust anti-Semitism might explain the choice of victims, but not how and why. And that's a really profound insight, which takes it away from this Israeli narrative and sort of, you know, makes us also look at other genocides, other calamities, and also, you know, the ever-present danger that mass killings, mass murder might happen again and might be legitimated using a particular discourse. And, you know, we've actually seen this happen right in front of our eyes over the last few months or so. So it's again astonishing, you know, again how a calamity, an atrocity from which various lessons were drawn in the 1940s, various institutions were created, various narratives, including of human rights, were generated, has again, you know, that whole sort of atrocity has been kind of privatized and turned into this, you know, essentially a narrative in the service of the State of Israel. And not even the service of the State of Israel, actually that's not accurate. It's a service in the service of Israeli fanatics, more accurately.
I want to bring the audience in a moment, but I just want to ask you the most difficult question, right, which is, where do we go from here? You know, it seems clear I mean, it seems to me at least, obviously the primary victims of what's happening at the moment are Palestinians. But it seems clear to me that Israel itself is an enormous victim of what it's doing. You know, that it's running itself into the ground in really very profound ways in terms of its own sense of itself, its own connection to the Jewish diaspora, its own connection to the West. And the unraveling of all of this, it's hard to predict how, but this does not feel like an expression of Jewish power in the end, or Israeli power, you know, as it's supposed to be. It actually feels like an expression of a very, very deeply divided, uncertain, poorly rooted Israeli right-wing project, which is literally just blood in the sand at this stage and has almost nothing else to say for itself.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly making, I think, Israel a very unstable and precarious nation state. I think just internally, the number of people who are going to leave, who are already leaving the country, because it's impossible for them to conduct their daily lives without fear of being drafted or being victims of a war that they probably don't want to be part of. The economy is doing badly. The tech industry is going to suffer, is already suffering. So in many ways, it's becoming an unviable country. But that's, of course, of no great comfort to its victims, who are the Palestinians. And that also doesn't guarantee that the Israelis will stop this madness and sort of turn into a peace-loving country. I think, as Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. And so nations can decline and sort of decay for a very long time. What's going to stop Israel from acting in the way it does? The only thing is American pressure.
Yeah.
There's no other, I mean, whichever way you think about it, Europe is completely impotent. They issue various statements. They know they can't do anything. They give the Palestinian Authority money to essentially, console their consciences, but they really have no power. Spain, Ireland, these two countries can, certainly increase moral pressure and act within the European community, essentially bring the Germans to their senses and tell them, look, this is, really terrible. You need to do something about this. But ultimately, I think change will only come when the United States changes its policy and starts issuing blank checks to the Israelis.
Yeah. Could we take the lights up, please? And we'll bring in the audience. Thank you very much. Yeah, 10 minutes. Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, is just maybe take 3 questions together, and then we'll put them back to Pankaj. So if you could just maybe wait for the mic, and thank you. So who would like to ask a question? Right down the front. No, you're not. No. Anybody else? Anybody want to bring? Yes, please. Could you pass the mic? Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. You referred to Nazism, and I just wanted to ask you, could you please elaborate a little bit on that? Because I didn't quite grasp it. Thank you.
Could we take another question as well, please? All right.
Thank you. The questions are too valuable as there are only 3. Each one weighs too heavily on the minds of us all. Reading your wonderful essay earlier in the year, it was Adorno I thought of, and who I don't think you mentioned. He said that it's after Auschwitz rather than after Gaza. Poetry will become impossible after Auschwitz. And I guess the legacy of this continuing tragedy which isn't over, is something I think we're all required to think about. And I suppose, maybe drawn back to some of your earlier work, part of the problem, I think, is the emotional legitimization that happens, or is attempted by the Israelis in relation to what they're doing, which kind of is part of a wider picture of politics today, where the deployment of emotions is increasingly prevalent, and where Andrew got his COVID, no doubt, at the Republican convention from the MAGA people. So I wonder if you could speak to that, about the emotional politics today and how that feeds into the legacy of Gaza, or after Gaza.
Thank you very much. And there's just right here, if you just hang on, and then we'll put these three back to Pankaj.
Hi, I'd be very interested in your views on the role of the Democrats in the United States in relation to what's going to happen, particularly in view of the emerging presidential situation there.
Great, thank you very much. So there was the question of Nazism and how that feeds into all of it, the emotional rhetoric and how that works, and what you think about the Democrats.
I think, Nazism probably is the best example of emotion in politics, of feeding upon very profound sense of humiliation, national humiliation, individual humiliation, and very successfully identifying an enemy, a scapegoat, a group of people who are to be held responsible for the plight of a particular national community. And I think practically every kind of nationalism has done that, to answer your question, but Nazism probably is the most extreme example of that, to very clearly identify the internal and external enemy, to make plans for its extermination, and then to also have the technical capacity to carry out that plan of extermination. A lot of people just stop at hating. But they went much, much further than most nationalists or most racists had previously. And I think that politics has never really gone away. I think it's returned. It seems like it has returned because we are more, perhaps, alert to the role of emotions, thanks to social media, thanks to greater exposure, and sort of unmediated exposure to political emotions. Previously, like, the liberal languages of the media, of the newspapers, have probably kept us from understanding how deep emotion still runs in most sort of societies and in politics. But now it's out there, and now it's expressed, much more vigorously and vehemently than before. And I think it's again the sort of same sense of being marginal. Being marginalized, being left behind, being scorned, being humiliated. I'm really struck by how potent the sense of social humiliation in all this is. How potent it was for the Nazis, how potent it was for the early Zionists too, and how potent it's for J.D. Vance, for instance. He really, in many ways, was a perfectly mediocre, Yale graduate with some literary ambitions, wanting to break into the liberal metropolitan intelligentsia, and then failed, and is now turned into lunatic, essentially. But it's something definitely worth looking at more closely. This particular trajectory, and just how demagogues do really have that gift, and they often are themselves victims of in many ways victims of humiliation. They have the gift to turn that into something very, very formidable politically. And I think that's perhaps what we've seen in so many examples, and most recently with the Israeli conduct. To answer the Adorno question, I think Adorno himself qualified that. He did acknowledge that yes, there was going to be art, nevertheless, and what kind of art is a question. Schoenberg, okay. Spielberg, definitely not. So they were definitely sort of, I think he came to a kind of nuanced appreciation of what kind of art is possible, and what kind of art misrepresents or distorts that particular experience. And I think there will be art and literature after Gaza, but I think I don't want to exaggerate this particular experience, but I do think that it's very strange. It's certainly for the first time, I may be wrong about this, since 45, that so many people around the world have lived with in such close proximity to acts of mass murder. And week after week after week after week. I don't really know what it does to the human psyche. I know I personally have felt very oppressed by it, physically, emotionally. I know many other people who have been forced to question a lot of their assumptions about their place in the world, and I think it's kind of radically destabilized people's identities, their sense of themselves, and what kind of art comes out of it. I think it'll be a difficult, complex art. The
last question was about the Democrats.
About the Democrats. Yeah. I think the Kamala Harris maneuvers, early moves, show that there is a kind of recognition that giving a blank check to Israel was a politically disastrous mistake, and that you could have kind of kept up your broad support of Israel and its right to defend itself, while at the same time being very deeply critical of the way it's conducted this self-defense, and that there is a nuanced position there which is electorally quite rewarding. And she's arrived at this particular position now. A lot depends on what her VP choice will be. There are people already scrutinizing the record of the various 3 or 4 candidates who are being discussed right now. So we'll see, who she chooses. But it remains a very live issue within the Democratic Party because a large part of the party, especially the young, also the minorities, the non-white minorities, the people who you can trust to go out and campaign, a lot of them have been deeply angered and alienated by Biden's attitude. So, we'll see whether Kamala Harris manages to persuade them to, come back to active politics.
Thank you very much. It's a grim time. It's a grim subject. All we can hold on to, I think, is the importance of honest articulation and of evidence-based analysis, which is rooted in both a dispassionate sense of history, but also a profound humanity. And I think Pankaj has given us a fantastic example of how that kind of discourse can be conducted and must be conducted. So I'd just like to thank him very much indeed.